your health and your success is predicted by the relationships that you have. You could be in the midst of a lot of people and still feel lonely. There was an increased mortality risk with increased loneliness, increased blood pressure with increased loneliness. And this to me is fascinating. Animals experience a release of endorphins when they engage in grooming and scratching and social play. And in humans, it's also released with hugging and touching and stroking and caressing. And that is why it feels so good to be hugged by someone. How do we understand others? And in the neuroscientific literature, there are roughly two schools of thought. The part of the brain that responds to hunger in hungry people also are the parts of the brain that respond to social hunger in socially hungry people. I personally find that to be absolutely fascinating, mind-blown. Social rejection tends to be extremely painful. I should not go and talk to this person because I'm going to feel a lot of fear. But when you go and actually talk to this person and say hi, what does science have to say about how do you form social connections? How do friendships happen? Do looks matter? How many hours does it take for a stranger to become my friend? A conversation is an exchange of emotions, and therefore social skills are largely emotional skills. Do not speak like this in a monotonous voice. That is not fun. That is boring. Before we move further, I would invite you to please subscribe to this channel. Something like this takes a lot of effort to make, and inviting guests of the highest calibers takes subscribers. So if you subscribe to this channel, it will help me make new videos. 80 to 90% of the people who listen to this podcast haven't subscribed. So if you like this episode, please do subscribe. Now on to the show. Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. In today's episode, we are going to talk about social connection. Now, if you don't know me, I am a DPhil student in psychology at the University of Oxford. And more specifically, I study social connection and loneliness and friendship formation. So this is right up my alleyway. In fact, you could say for the information I'm going to present right now, it took me 3, 4, 5 years to study. And what I've done is crystallize all the insights that psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and even some related fields have about making friendships and making more connections and feeling like you're belonged in this world. And I'm going to crystallize them, but also not water them down. So this episode is going to be hard hitting in terms of it's going to be rigorous. I'm not going to make this for YouTube attention spans. So what I do promise is if you stick around for whatever long this takes, you will have a comprehensive understanding of what social connection is and how science and psychologists and neuroscientists study it, where you will understand how friendships happen in the brain, like what parts of the brain are involved, what do these parts normally do. And we're going to talk about some things like what is the optimal size of friendships. And there is such a thing like that. There is such a thing as too much that your brain can't handle. And there is such a thing as too little as well. And we're going to go into that. And then I'm going to finally wrap with some actionable, practical things like action steps that you can do to make more friends, to feel less lonely and feel more belonged. And all of this will be gathered through science, but also my personal experience. Like I grew up shy. There's a reason why I study this, because I want to understand social connection in as much detail as possible. So the way this is going to be structured is I'm going to start with the science first. We're going to talk about some important psychological findings about friendships. And then on the latter part, I'm going to talk about how do you put this into action? How do you go ahead and make friends? How do you deal with rejection? And what things do you say? What do I do if I run out of things to say? I'm going to cover all of that in this episode. So if you have ever wondered how to have more social skills, this episode is going to present you all the theory, the science of it, and the practical applications of it. So I'm going to start with something called as the grant study. And this beginning is right in the alley of talking about what social connection is and why is it so important for humans. Like, why do people matter for us so much? And in the first part, I'm just going to prove it to you based on some studies we have that it indeed does matter. So take a look at this grant study, which is also called as the Harvard Study of Adult Human Development. And this is one of the longest running studies ever done in psychology. I believe it started in 1942. And what it does is, or what it did, and it still continues even right today, is it took 268 Harvard undergraduate students and they followed them for 75 years. And what they're doing right now in present day in this study is they're following their kids. And one of the participants of this study was actually JFK, John F. Kennedy. And what they do is follow these people, and every few, months, I'm not exactly sure of their frequency, but every now and then they ask these people what makes a meaningful life and what brings us happiness and those sorts of questions to really understand on a long-term scale what matters and what does not matter. And what they found was one thing came up again and again, no matter what question they asked about long-term growth. And this question was health, especially in old age, and financial success correlates with the warmth of your relationships. So what the study found was that your health and both your success is predicted by the number and the quality, more importantly, of the relationships that you have. So this is like this motivating study often used to motivate the study of social connection and not just dismisses as something that, just happens on the weekends or something like that. So throughout this whole episode, I'm going to use friendships in a certain way. I'm going to talk about friendships in a more broader sense. So normally when we talk about friendships, we tend to distinguish it from romantic relationships or family relationships. And in this case, I'm using it to encapsulate them all. So friendships include relationships with your partner, relationships with your family. And indeed, a lot of people do say that, look, my partner, he or she is my best friend, or my mother is my best friend. And there is a reason for that, is because friendship does tend to be, at least in the way the science is done, and the studies I'm going to talk about, is this more fundamental unit of connection. So think of it as just relationships that are close enough. And this is what friendship is defined as: the number, as the connections in your life that you want to maintain some level of contact with. So there are these people that you want to have in life and you want to proceed with those relationships. So what I'm going to talk about, even though I'm going to use the word friends, is going to apply to dates, is going to apply to marriages and parents and siblings, and all of that is going to be much more generic. Now, of course, this is not to say that romantic relationships and familial relationships aren't different from friendships. Yes, in a different way, yes. And these relationships are different. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to use the word friendships in a more broader sense. Now, so the first branch of studies I'm going to talk about are studies around loneliness. Now, loneliness, you may have seen that during the pandemic, a lot of people say that I've been feeling lonely. And even after the pandemic, that sense might have continued. And then there is this other branch of studies, which is about social network sizes. So loneliness, think of loneliness as something you have, which is a feeling. It's a subjective sense of how connected you feel with the world. There's another branch of studies that study network sizes. And what that means is they're studying the amount, the quantity, the objective quantity that you can measure. And both these things matter for our health, mental health, and so on. So not only do we want to have a lot of people in our lives, which is good, but that in itself does not mean that you will not feel lonely. Loneliness can be an independent thing of its own. You can be surrounded, you could be in the midst of a lot of people and still feel lonely. And that is completely possible. That happens. And so we're going to talk about both of them in this. So let's start with loneliness. And a lot of this work has been done by these social scientists, John and Stephanie Cacioppo, if I'm saying that correct. And their key findings has been social relationship and health have a lot to do with each other. So they study the effects of perceived social isolation, which are, in other words, loneliness. And they found that in animals, so for example, like the fruit fly, they found that social isolation has been shown to decrease the lifespan of the fruit fly. And this study was done by Ruan and Wu in 2008. And Cacioppo also points out that the lack of social connection, which is loneliness, also leads to the development of obesity and type 2 diabetes in mice. And so this is like, Cacioppo is like these broad researchers who have studied many different studies, and they collated into what scientists called a review paper. And so there are these various studies that they highlight. Now in humans, you might be wondering, okay, good for the mouse, good for the Drosophila. What about humans? And what they found was humans, there was an increased mortality risk with increased loneliness. There was increased blood pressure with increased loneliness. And this to me is fascinating, because what we're talking about, essentially loneliness, is a subjective measure. Notice we are not talking about the objective number of friends in your life. We're not talking about how many people are wishing you on your birthday, nothing like that. We are talking about the subjective sense of feeling lonely. And that has all of these physical ramifications, like increased mortality risk, increased blood pressure, and diminished immunity. And so if you're interested in more of this sort of research, then I highly recommend John and Stephanie Cacioppo's work. Moving on to objective friend numbers, also known as social networks in the scientific literature, we find that there was this very interesting study where they took some people and they injected rhinoviruses in these people. So that's fancy way of saying that they caused a common cold by purpose. And what these scientists did was they found that people who had a lot of social ties, so this is again the objective number of people in their lives, they contracted less symptoms from these rhinoviruses that they gave people. So these people were less susceptible to the cold. They produced more mucus, which is good because that helps you clear your nasal passages. And they led to shedding less viruses. They were less contagious, in other words. So people who had a higher objective number of people in their lives, they just had a better response to this common cold that they injected in people's bodies. Now, this study is quite old. It's done in 1997. And S. Cohen is the first author, if you are interested in checking this out. I imagine something like this might be a bit unethical to be done today. I'm not 100% sure. Now, I want to take a moment and switch to the neuroscience side of things. And a lot of the literature that I'm going to cite comes from textbooks written by Michael Gazzaniga, Richard Ivory, George Mangan. So just wanted to point that out before we get into the nitty-gritties of what your brain does when you're forming social connection and forming new friendships and so on. The biggest thing about neuroscience, I feel, about the social neuroscience area is this idea called the social brain hypothesis. Now, what does that mean? Now, social brain hypothesis, the person who came up with it first was this professor of evolutionary psychology called Robin Dunbar. He's actually at Oxford, and I might try and invite him for this. But the social brain hypothesis, what he says in that is primates, which is like monkeys, humans, chimpanzees, so on, primates have a larger brain size. And the reason why they have a larger brain size is because we are doing a lot of social interactions. We're having a lot of social connection, a lot of social contact. And the reason why we have these massive brains, which other animals in the animal kingdom do not have, is because they're not as socially complex. So most of our brain has developed not to be intelligent, not to do fancy stuff like solving a math problem, but to make social connections. But what is the purpose of it? And the reason for that, it tends to have quite a large survival value. So imagine if you are living back in the day with the cave people, then you have a lot of threats around you. And humans aren't necessarily the strongest species on the planet. So what happens is when you have this social group, when you have this social group with you can cooperate, one person can take care perhaps in the night, can see if nothing's bad is happening, the other person can look at it in the daytime, and then just multiply that by many people. And this ability to cooperate balances a lot of risks that we have as animals. And therefore, social ties tend to be very important for our survival. And the social brain hypothesis claims that the reason why we have so much of brain volume as mammals, as primates, in fact, is because that's evolutionary survival need that humans have. And the form that a lot of Dunbar's work takes is in the form of Dunbar's numbers. This is this idea that there is a limit to, or there's an optimal number of people that you can have in your life. In other words, the social connections that you have in your life, you can only maintain a certain amount, and that amount tends to be about 150 people. Now you might be like, that sounds like a random number. Where did that come from? And where it comes from is Robin's work on analyzing the average group size of many mammals and then looking at their brain sizes. So imagine for every set of, let's say we have rhesus monkeys, and let's say we have marmosets, then we have chimpanzees. You can look at their brain size, and you can look at the average amount of conspecifics, which means co-monkeys that these people hang out with, these animals hang out with. And based on that, what you can see is there is a relationship between the size of the brain and the size of the group that these animals are hanging out with. So the larger their brain volume, the larger the size of the group that these animals hang out in. And if you just take that and extend that for humans, because humans, we know what the brain size is, we can predict the average amount of people that humans will hang out with. So that was Dunbar's number, which is the average amount of group size that we can maintain at most. And that tends to be 150 for modern humans. So around 150 people, 150 relationships is what our brain can realistically maintain. Now it gets even interesting that not all friends are created equal. Not all relationships are created equal. We all know that we have some people in our lives who are extremely close. And then there are other people in our lives who must be much more far afar, and we don't perhaps pay as much attention to them. Perhaps we don't care as much about them, or it's just not within our realm of bothering. We are not bothered as much about other people. What Professor Dunbar has shown is that, and his colleagues, of course, it's not just one person ever. There's a lab involved in science. So what Professor Dunbar has shown is that not only do we have friendships as one category, but there are concentric circles in which friendship happens. And by that, we have a circle which is the tighter circle. Then we have a circle which is slightly broader than that. Then we have a circle which is even more broader, and so on. And what's even more interesting is that the amount of people you can maintain in a circle is also determined. So not only do we have this mega grand friendship, 150 people that we can have friendships with, but every concentric ring in this mega grand circle has a number associated with it as well. So for example, the tightest innermost circle may have 5 people in it. And then the next circle may have 15 and 45. In fact, what the data shows is every circle you go outside, so every next circle of closeness has 3 times as many people as the previous circle. So in your tightest circle, you have 15, then you have, in your tightest circle, you have 5, then you have 15 and 45 and so on. And that's how this our sense of forming connections scales with as many people. So you don't need millions of people in the age of internet. You still just perhaps need 150 people for your mental and physical health. And some of you might be like, that's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot in the grand scheme of things. But in your tightest circle, which will probably affect your health the most, you need 5. Right? So it's just not a lot. And we do that naturally many times. So for example, in my college community, I will certainly know 50 people or 150 people rather, to call them friends. And of course, there will be closer circles who will be extremely tight and intimate friends. So point being that friendships aren't necessarily random. There's a structure to how we have our close and intimate friendships versus how we have our distant friendships. Now, one thing worth reflecting in all of this is that our family size has gotten smaller and smaller over the years. And by what that means is that the amount of people that we know by default has gotten smaller and smaller. And now these slots that are empty need to be filled, and those are still needs that need to be met. And so that's why it could explain the rise of loneliness, because now everyone has to work harder to fill in those slots that would come by default by something that you have to do on your own. Like you have to put your own effort to make these new friendships, because look, family and our community is not providing it to us by default. Now, going back to the brain development point earlier, which is that our brains might have developed to support social cognition, to support social interaction. There is this theory or idea that adolescence is a period where we are essentially developing social skills. We are developing the ability to read minds, in other words. And the whole of development has that, to be clear. It's not just during adolescence that it happens, but adolescence might be also a critical period where social skills are being developed. And so the way of functioning, our sense of how we function in the social world, is developed very strongly. And I know a lot of people listening to this will be in that adolescence category, which is maybe 25 years or younger. And just know that there is more coming. If you are in that group, then you might be experiencing a very heightened increase in your social needs and social abilities both. And so if you feel particularly lonely in this time, maybe it's worth having that perspective that things might settle down a little bit going further. And going ahead, what is happening is not only are you developing other parts of your brain like intelligence and the prefrontal cortex and so on, but you're also significantly developing your social skills and your social abilities. So now let's talk about what happens in the brain when you have social interactions. What happens to the brain when we make friends? What happens to the brain when we talk to people? And what is happening effectively is the release of hormones called as endorphins. Now, endorphins are also released in the brain when you exercise, and they are hormones or peptides in the brain that lead to a lowering of brain thresholds, and it leads to an increase of pleasure. So these are molecules that when released in your brain, you feel pleasure, you feel less pain, and you feel like good. And anyone who has had a good social interaction knows what I'm talking about, which is you, because we've all had some sort of a social interaction which is good. So endorphins, when released in the brain, they give us this sense of feeling good. And this sense of feeling good is conserved evolutionarily. So what that means is that animals who do not have as complex as social structures as ours, other animals also experience the release of endorphins when they engage in social behaviors. Now, what are social behaviors for animals who don't speak? This could be grooming, like back scratching. People think that it is for hygiene that animals might be scratching their back. It is like a natural cleaning mechanism. And while that might be true, it might be a hygiene thing. A more prominent reason for doing that, including in addition to the hygiene reason, is actually to form social connections. And this is evidenced by the fact that animals experience a lot of release of endorphins when they engage in grooming and scratching and that sort of social play, that sort of behavior. And in humans, it's also released with more of our kinds of social behavior like hugging and touching and stroking and caressing. All of those things lead to an experience of endorphins. And that is why it feels so good to be hugged by someone. It feels good to be in vicinities of someone. Now, you clearly know that humans have a higher social appetite and they maintain a lot more connections than animals do. And we cannot go and hug 150 people. That's not possible to maintain those social relationships with that many amount of people in a more physical kind of way. So the evolutionary theory suggests that acts like laughter, acts like dancing, or should I say activities like dancing, and rituals like religious ceremonies, things like singing together in a group, they have all evolved to trigger the same endorphin mechanism. So every time you're with someone and you're singing together and you're laughing and you're having a good time, chances are that the reason why it feels so good is because of the release of these chemicals called endorphins in your body. Now, a lot of times when social connection is discussed, more than endorphins, what is discussed is this chemical called oxytocin, which is also known as the cuddle hormone in pop culture. And it is indeed true that social connection does release oxytocin, but it must be said that endorphins are probably the bigger and the more important, in this case, hormone to study. And what scientists have found is that when they control for endorphin release, you may find that oxytocin is important only perhaps in romantic relationships, if at all. So endorphins tend to be a bigger character in this story, is what I understand from the literature. Now let's move on to particular parts of the brain. Let's zoom in on the brain in detail and see what's happening when we are forming social connection, when we are making new friendships and so on. So there's a part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex. Now this might sound like a fancy name, but all it means is it's a medial region. So it's in the middle of the front of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is the sort of evolutionarily recent part of the brain, which is right in the front, which is involved in high order thinking, decision making, and so on. So this is part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, which scientists have shown, which neuroimaging studies have shown, is involved in self-referential thinking. Now, what do I mean by self-referential thinking? It is when you're thinking about yourself as opposed to someone else. So for example, if I sat you in a room and gave you some qualities about yourself, as if I described yourself, but without saying that it's about you, and then I gave you the qualities of someone else, let's say the President of the United States, what your medial prefrontal cortex will do is it will light up in relation to the words when it hears the words, when it sees the words that are about you, and it will not light up, or rather it will light up less, because no part of the brain is ever turned off, by the way. It will light up less when you are listening to a description of someone else. And this sort of a study has been done by William Kelly in Dartmouth College. So this is the medial prefrontal cortex, and that's what it's doing. And this medial prefrontal cortex tends to be a part of a larger network of brain regions called the default mode network, which is engaged in self-referential thinking. Default mode network is involved in things like self-referential thinking, daydreaming, and often when we are daydreaming, we're often thinking about ourselves. But even if you're not, we are engaging our default mode networks. Meditation, this is a bit of a tangent, but meditation, which is something that I tend to be interested in, tends to reduce activity in the default mode network. And this is confirmed. Nothing is ever confirmed in science, but this is found rather in studies that investigate these athlete-like meditators who have been meditating for years and decades of their life. And they find that when people meditate, there's a reduced activity of the default mode network, which, to remind you, which is associated with daydreaming or mind wandering or self-referential thinking. A funny story about the discovery of the default mode network, by the way, is that they discovered it when they were giving people tasks to do in an MRI scanner. And what they found was that the brain and particular parts of the brain, very predictable particular parts of the brain, were activated when people were doing nothing. And that's how the discovery of the default mode network came in, that's how the brain behaves when it's at default. So that is about the self. Now the question is, okay, this is how self-referential thinking works. How about others? How do we understand others? And in the neuroscientific, cognitive neuroscience literature, there are roughly two schools of thought in which how we relate to others, that explain how we relate to others. The first school of thought is what's called through empathy. And this is often supported by these findings about mirror neurons, which I'm going to talk about a bit. But the first school of thought is empathy. And the second school of thought tends to be what's called theory of mind. So in empathy, in theories of empathy, the way I'm connecting with you is literally feeling your feelings. So if you have pain, I'll be like, oh, my dear, that sounds so awful. And then this is how we might connect. And if you have a good, you celebrate, you have some achievement in life, I might be like, yeah, let's go, my friend, let's do it. And when we do that, this is me being empathetic. I'm like feeling your feelings and I'm like joining you in that celebration, in that contagious feeling experience. In contrast, the other school of thought tends to be theory of mind, which is I might have some feelings about it, but I also have interpretations about how you're feeling based on your body language, based on your posture, based on your vocal tonality, and so on. And based on my past experiences being in similar situations. So I may not be feeling as much or as clearly as you are about your current situation. Heck, I might be feeling something completely different. I might be in a bad mood. And yet I'm able to congratulate you if you won a prize. Or if you feel bad, then I'm still able to be there for you and support you, even though I'm not empathetically feeling the pain itself. And in the neuroscience world, we're probably seeming to arrive at the conclusion where both of these systems are engaged when we engage in social interaction. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about the empathy first, empathy school of thought. But there's this other scientist called Pellegrino who pieced this puzzle together, saying that, look, monkeys' neurons activate not only when they are doing that thing, but when they observe someone else doing the same thing. And so the discovery of these sets of neurons is what's called mirror neurons. So they are mirroring someone else without me mirroring the action itself. And this sort of discovery is in favor of the empathy school of thoughts, where, look, I'm actually literally feeling your feeling. There's also circuits now, subsequently, we have discovered the circuits in the brain, parts of the brain that mirror disgust. So if someone is disgusted, I might feel that, and there's that contagion. And there's this part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, which studies have shown tracks disgust in close others, so in your tighter circle, but not as much in distant others. So if someone in your family or close circle is feeling disgust, or even pain for that matter, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a part of the frontal part of the brain, tracks that. It lights up when this person in your close circle is feeling disgust or pain in your close circle, but not as much when they are in the distant circle. And then there's also this part of the brain called the insula, which also tracks disgust in others. So this axis of disgust and purity tends to have correlates in the brain where it is actively tracked. Now, the other school of thought, called the theory of mind school of thought, remember, suggests that we pay attention to others, we connect with others, not through empathy processes, which means I'm not literally feeling everything that you are feeling, but through cognitive processes, which means, hey, look, I've been in similar situations, I have similar experiences, I can infer things and so on. So it's much more of a higher order, complex process. And then there is indeed some process for, some evidence for that as well. And I'm not going to go into details about talking about specific studies because this video will end up too long. But there are parts of the brain called the temporoparietal junction, more specifically the right R, TPJ, right, temporoparietal junction, which is involved in theory of mind type processes, in addition to the medial prefrontal cortex, which we discussed earlier. If you're interested in this theory of mind perspective, there's a brilliant TED talk by this MIT cognitive scientist called Rebecca Sachs. I highly recommend. I will put a link about this in the description. An interesting finding which is in favor of the theory of mind hypothesis is that if you look at these brain regions which is involved in theory of mind, and if you look at the gray matter volume, which tends to be a representation of better connectivity and better strength use of that area, let's just say. If you look at gray matter volume and if you look at their social network size, so the amount of people in their social network, you will see that as the gray matter volume increases, the social network size increases. In other words, if I put it more hand wavily, the parts of the brain are stronger for people who have more friends in their circle, for people who have more connections. The parts of the brain related to theory of mind, which is me understanding mental states of others, is higher. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but all of these networks that I was talking about earlier is altered in states like autism, which is further evidence that these social functions are indeed coded in the brain regions like the MPFC and the RTPJ that we talked about earlier. So just to wrap this section a little bit, between the two competing theories of how we indeed make friends and what is the neural mechanism, what's happening in our brain when we are making new connections, we find that there are two competing theories, although there's good evidence for both, which is one is mirror neurons and empathy, which is I'm feeling the feelings of the other person, and the other being theory of mind, which I'm not feeling, but I have this mental ability to understand and infer states of others. And there's evidence to support both and neural basis of both. There's this other part of the brain that is called the orbitofrontal cortex, which is more on the sides of the brain, more on the peripheries, but also in the front. And this part of the brain tends to code a social context. So if you've ever been in a situation where some things are just socially inappropriate, so for example, in the cognitive neuroscience textbook, the example is given of, let's say someone gave you a gift and you forget about someone who gave you that gift. And then later this person comes to your house and then you're chilling with them and you accidentally break that gift. Let's say it was a glass cup. And if you break that glass cup, then you just say that, hey, look, never mind. It was some gift that someone gave that I didn't like at all. No, not knowing that the person who gave the gift is sitting in front of you. And now if you understand any social context, you would know that, hey, look, this is inappropriate. You don't say that to someone. You don't insult someone's gift in front of them. Like you don't tell them that their gift is bad. It's socially inappropriate. And the reason why I'm explaining all of this is not because I don't think you understand social context, but just to make the experiment explicitly clear. And what they found is that people who had orbitofrontal cortex damage, so people who had lesions, which is like damages in the orbitofrontal cortex, they experience a lack of understanding of such social contexts. So they are not able to understand what is socially appropriate and socially inappropriate. And someone with a weak or a damaged orbitofrontal cortex will experience these symptoms. And they will be totally fine in other areas, by the way. It's not that they can't function, but it's this specific thing that is impaired. All right, so all of this discussion of science is pointing towards this idea that social connection is indeed fundamentally important for the brain. There are resources that are devoted in the brain for us to form social connections, for us to bond with each other, and for us to connect. So this leads to the idea that social connection is a fundamental human need. And this idea has been proposed by social psychologist Roy Baumeister and Leary. And I hope I'm saying that correct. And what they have essentially proposed is that social connection, looking at all of this evidence about loneliness, about the brain regions and the amount of people, the primates and how they behave, it seems like social connection is not a periphery, it's not an accessory in our life, but in fact is a fundamental human need. And to support that hypothesis even more, there's this study that recently came out of MIT. The first author of this paper is Tomova. I believe her name is Livia Tomova. I might be wrong on that. And I believe she's in Professor Rebecca Sachs's lab, who I talked about when I talked about the RTPJ, the right temporoparietal junction. And what they found, they did this study in which they starved certain people just for a number of hours, not a lot, and maybe fasted is the better way of putting it. They induced hunger, that is a better way of putting it. And similarly, they took another group of people and induced social hunger, in other words, social isolation. So I think it was an overnight period where they fed no food, and in the other group, they were allowed to have food, but they were not allowed to meet people. They were not allowed to have social contact. And the next following day, they scanned their brains. And what they did was they showed these people's pictures of either social connections, so people in their lives, so friends and family and so on, or they showed them pictures of food. And they showed them pictures of food rather, because they showed both of them. And what they found was that the part of the brain that responds to hunger in hungry people also are the parts of the brain that respond to social hunger in socially hungry people. And these tends to be dopaminergic parts of the brain. I think they studied the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. And again, I'm not going to sadly go more in depth into it, although I did make a whole podcast episode on dopamine that you may want to check out. So they took these people, showed them different pictures, and found that social hunger and hunger tend to have similar parts of the brain that they're activating, further adding to the idea that social connection is a fundamental human need, as important as food. And social starvation will also lead to at least mental health consequences, and you might feel that you are lacking in pleasure and motivation and energy. That's what dopamine tends to encode. In my own research, I studied this part of the brain called the dorsal raphe nucleus. Now, this is quite new. This is quite in the extremities of science. But what we have found is that in monkeys, the dorsal raphe nucleus tends to track background reward rate. Now, this is not my study, but some people in the lab who I know have shown that the dorsal raphe nucleus tends to track average reward rates for monkeys. And these rewards are food rewards. And in my study, I have found that in a similar fashion, the dorsal raphe nucleus might be tracking social reward rate. And that is what I have been looking into in the last few years of my life. Speaking of more cutting edge and recent science, there's a paper came out in 2023, so extremely recent, and I think it was the late part of 2020, where they investigate the role of the gut in social connection and social anxiety more specifically. So this is quite a groundbreaking study. What they did was they took people with social anxiety and they took people without social anxiety, so-called healthy controls. And what they found was that the people who had social anxiety had a different gut microbiome composition. So if you don't know what that is, we all have a gut, and there are microbiomes in this gut. So these are tiny bacteria and millions and in fact billions of them living in your gut. And what you can do is these bacteria attach themselves, so to speak, when you poop. And so what you can do is take a poop sample and analyze the bacteria diversity that comes out of this poop. And what they found is that the people who had social anxiety had a significantly different and a noticeably different gut microbiome composition, which the healthy controls did not. They had a different composition. And there were specific bacterial strains that these authors were able to identify. If you're interested in this, I believe the first author of this paper is Ritz, and it's actually a 2024 paper. I said 2023. I believe that was submitted in 2023 and accepted in 2024, so extremely recent. And what's even more fantastic and mind-blowing to me at least is that now what they did is they took these microbiome samples from social anxiety patients and they transplanted these microbiomes into healthy mice. And they gave these mice antibiotics to wipe off their previous bacteria and transplanted this new microbiome in the new mice. And what they found was that the mice started showing social fear behaviors. And none of the other behaviors were affected. They were doing fine in other social tasks even. But specifically in social fear behaviors is where the mice showed impaired behavior. Like they showed more avoidance of other mice that they were afraid of, and so on and so forth. And I personally find that to be absolutely fascinating, that you can take a social anxiety patient, take their gut microbiome, implant it in mice which had no problems whatsoever, and now voila, they show some social anxiety behavior. Mind blown. And I'll talk about applications about this soon, but this might open a whole new area of social connection treatment, which is through not just meeting people, but perhaps through your diet and things like that. So a way to feel connected might be through your diet and what you eat, and maybe that's the area to look at as much as also meeting others. But we'll come to that in a bit. And the final piece of the puzzle I want to fit here in the neuroscience area is the idea of social status. Now, we do care about social connection, but we are pack animals, and we do care also about where in the social hierarchy this person is sitting in. Now, especially when it comes to more transactional types of social connection, like for example, when you want to get a job or when you want to get more fame or something like that, our minds are attracted to people with higher social status. We want to be in vicinities of people with higher social status. And this is not just status in terms of money. It could be status in terms of looks. And there is a whole area of study in evolutionary psychology which says that a lot of our mating behaviors, so the reason why we form connection with others for sexual reasons, has to do with status. We might be looking for the most beautiful woman or something, and that is actually a status measure. And on the contrary, we might be looking at someone who's more muscular, and that might be status in its own way. So what is the scale along which we are distinguishing between social hierarchies might be different, but we do care about status a lot. And indeed, there are parts of the brain that track your mobility in that status hierarchy that you care about. And this is beautifully demonstrated by this study coming from China by the first author is called Fan, F-A-N, Fan. And this published in 2023 in Cell. And they showed that They took mice and they showed that if you disturb the social ranking of these mice, so if you make them move up or make them go down, and I think in this case only go down to be clear, the move up is more of a generalization that we can make, but it's not necessarily shown in this paper. But when you affect the social mobility of this mice, when you induce a social downfall, there are parts of the brain that are involved in negative reward that light up. For example, the lateral habenula. And again, this is where I stop because there's going to be a bit of a rabbit hole if I tell you all that the habenula does and the connections it has with other parts of the brain. But know that status and social mobility is important and we cannot just ignore it. And there are neural paths that are involved in social status. All right, so with all of this importance of social connection for us, our brains, our lives, our health, our lifespan, and so on, why don't we just make more friends? Like, why don't we just go out and talk to people? Why don't we always take an effort to be socially engaged? And to be fair, we do. Most of us take some effort or the other to meet people. But perhaps most of us also feel that there might be more of expansion that we could have in the social realm, that we could go out and talk to more people. And at least I have that. And indeed, if you're feeling lonely, then you will definitely have that. So why don't we do that? What stops us from doing that? It turns out that we have mechanisms to fear rejection as well. Now remember, social connection matters a lot, and if you go back, the reason why it matters so much is because we depend on others for our survivals, especially in the cave person days. And even today, like a lot of our security, like physical security, is premised on social connection. And if something happens, we trust that the police will come and help us, or we trust that our friends will come and help us. And so rejection, which is social disconnection, tends to affect us a lot. So not only does social connection release endorphins, it does all of that good things, social rejection tends to be extremely painful. And it may involve, again, parts of the brain that are involved in negative reward, as I mentioned earlier. So we all have a fear of rejection, and it tends to be an important thing to keep in mind. Here's also the interesting things which I have discovered working with someone like Dr. Aziz, who I have a podcast with, which is when you actually go out and talk to people, hey, look, we feel a lot of fear, we feel like a lot of anticipatory fear and anxiety, but a lot of that fear can be misplaced. We can be making assumptions about how much we are going to get rejected, but those assumptions might be miscalibrated. So I might be convinced, our minds might be totally convinced, because rejection is so painful, that I should not go and talk to this person because, hey, look, I'm going to feel a lot of fear. But when you go and actually talk to this person and say hi, most of the times what happens is people just say hi back. And a significant proportion of those times you have decent conversations. And here I'm speaking from personal experience. As a scientist, by the way, I've tried to not only understand this from a theoretical perspective, but I've tried my best to go out and talk to people and put myself in this uncomfortable zone of making friends and putting myself on the line of rejection. And to some extent, this is what I'm doing that right now. And one side story is that after doing that, I've noticed that I've basically had zero camera anxiety. Like I can totally imagine like a few years from now when I did not do this work of confidence and rejection and going out mostly under the guidance of Dr. Aziz, I would have not had this camera confidence. I would not have had this much level of ease in talking to the camera. So something to know when I talk about the exercises for rejection, you may want to consider the benefits like this, like camera confidence that it brings along. All right. But there was this study done by Cardas 2021, and again, I might be butchering this name, where what they made is forced people to have conversations with strangers. And what they found is that when you forced people to have conversations with strangers, the level of awkwardness that you feel before the interaction and when you have the interaction, it feels significantly less awkward. They had these participants rate how awkward will this feel, and do you think this will be very awkward? And most people are like, yeah, I don't know if I want to talk to people. And when they actually have the connection, not only do they feel less awkward, but they also feel good. And the key finding from this paper was participants tend to be especially prone to overestimate how awkward deep conversations with strangers feel. as compared to shallow conversations. So simple interventions like these can help us feel more connected. If you're feeling lonely and isolated, there could be complex things, and if it's significant, I encourage you to seek mental health support from a professional. But on a more, from looking at the science, what could be gleaned is if you just go out and just strike some conversations, that in itself may be making a lot of headway. And indeed, from personal experience, I can confirm that is true. Like, one of the most popular things I've ever said on my podcast, and one of the most quoted things that I've said on my podcast, is social connection is one of the best antidepressants I have ever experienced. Social connection has been a phenomenal antidepressant, and you feel just great when you make contact with new people, new strangers, new attractive people that you might want to date and flirt, and all of those things definitely leads to a lot of well-being. So this is an application that you might want to implement in your life, where you're just, when you're waiting for the bus, when you're in a queue, just say hi. It doesn't have to be a deep conversation. Just say hi, and you are quite likely to feel better. And of course, if you need more help, always seek professional help. I'm not here to replace that at all. So by now you can tell that we're already moving more into the practical side of social connection. So let's now move on to the practical side of things. What does science have to say about how do you actually go ahead and form social connections? How do social connections happen? How do friendships happen? And what we can glean from all the science we have heard so far is that social connection works both with respect to depth and with respect to breadth. What do I mean by that? We not only should focus on creating and maintaining relationship with close people, but we should also focus on having plenty of people in our wider circle. In fact, if we go by the nuclear family hypothesis, what that might suggest is most of our intimate needs are met, but not as much as our more distant circle needs. But of course, individual circumstances might be different. Your circumstance might be different than others. So adapt it to your circumstance. The one thing that science does seem to suggest is that both matter. So do not ignore either. So think of it as, if I take a heart rate analogy, think of it like as doing more steady state, slower paced exercises versus doing some max heart rate, like high intensity interval training stuff. So think of it like that. You need both to maintain a healthy heart. Similarly, to maintain good health with respect to social connection as a result of friendships and relationships and so on, aim to have both good quality deep friendships and relationships, and aim to have more broader acquaintances and close friends and distant friends as well. There is this age-old question that do looks matter, and it's granted this question is mainly asked in the dating area, but it turns out that looks matter significantly irrespective of the relationship we are talking about. So there is this interesting study done by Harrell, is the first author's name, where they looked at parents and they took these parent-child duos and sent them in a supermarket. And what they found is that parents who had better-looking children, again self-reported, paid more attention to their children as compared to the non-better looking students. I know it's depressing to hear that, but it does seem to be true that the people in our lives, the children and the adults and everyone in our lives who are slightly better looking may get more of a preference on a more primal level. Now, of course, that does not mean that this is inherently determined. I don't mean to sound deterministic saying, oh, now you're all screwed. You can't make more friends because you're not good looking. I thought that only applied to dating and now it applies to friendship. No, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is there seems to be some relationship of appearance, and whether or not that is intrinsic or whether you can change it through like your style and all of that, I believe that the latter to be the case. So hopefully it doesn't invoke disappointment and resentment, but instead it invokes knowledge and insight. Like this is another dial that I can play with if I want to make better social connections. The field of social psychology has done a lot of work on how humans form friendships, and they have tried to disentangle how humans form friendships. And what they found is there are three key factors that determine when we like others and when indeed we form friendships. And these three key factors are: one, similarity. So humans tend to form friendships with people who are like them. And this is not new, right? You always see people like, I live in Oxford, which is quite an international city, but it's not uncommon for me to see friend circles who are largely either doing similar things or look the same. They might be the same nationality, is what I mean. and so on. And you might indeed find that in your experience, that people around you cluster in groups that are like each other. The other factor that social psychology suggests is influential in friendship formation is proximity, which means that if I'm close to someone, literally, physically, then I might form friendships with this person. And then there are these studies of, hey, look, people and friends and college students who live in the same corridor tend to be better friends, tend to make more friendships than people who are living across the street or something, despite nothing else changing. And there's this proximity effect of forming friendships. And the third one is, I talk about similarity, I talk about proximity. And the third one is familiarity, which means, hey, look, if this person seems familiar in some way. So for example, this person looks just like my grandmother, or this person looks like my older friend back in the day, then I might have a stronger tendency to form a friendship with this sort of a person. So these are three factors that social psychology suggests is influential in forming friendships and making connections. There's this ultra fascinating study that I decided to just include in this today, which looks at different social scales, so which means who's closer to me, who's further to me in my social scale. And then they look at spatial scales, which means, look, my house is closer in that spatial scale than the playground or London, the city. We have a different sense, a spatial sense of how close this is to us. And there are different parts of the brain that represent different social and spatial scales. And the parts of the brain in which we have a closed spatial sense, for example, my house, this is more close to me, this is more intimate, also tend to be the parts of the brain which represent close friendships and intimate friendships. So I just found that fascinating that in the brain, these spatial and social scales tend to have overlapping representations. So the similar parts of the brain are activating when you think of a close friend and you think of a closed and personal and intimate room, versus you think of a distant acquaintance and then you're thinking like a city, and that's the part of the brain that's representing those things. One question that you might wonder after all of this is, how many hours does it take for a stranger to become my friend? There are several answers to this, but one study points at 200 being the key figure, approximately that is, where someone goes from being a total acquaintance or a stranger even to good friends. And about 100 to 150 tends to be the number of hours that you have to spend with someone for them to consider you friends, just friends, not especially close friends, and 200 for kind of close friends. Okay, now we get to the part of the video where we talk about action steps. The science was wonderful and brilliant, and I hope you learned a lot from it. But what does it mean? What do I do? What do I go out and talk to people? What does it look like? What does a social fitness plan, so to speak, look like? And this is definitely coming into the area of personal opinion. Look, science is normally descriptive. It doesn't talk about what you should do and should not do. It can just describe reality mostly. Just bear in mind that while all of what I have been talking so far was largely based on peer-reviewed high-quality studies, what I'm going to talk about now is largely coming from some understanding of clinical psychology and how change works, behavior change works, but also a lot of my personal opinion coming from personal experience also. So this is the part where it does get me talking to you directly rather than me describing the science. Just wanted to put that out there. Okay. The first action step that we can glean from all the science is that we have to accept that social connection is important for us. Like, we cannot ignore social connection at all. Like, we have parts of the brain that represent social connection. We have parts of the brain that give us pain that if we don't get social connection. And in fact, science might even be suggesting that social connection is a fundamental human need. So whenever we feel feelings of social isolation, it's important to not discount them. It's important to take them as seriously as you would take perhaps hunger, or you would take something that's extremely important to you, and treat social connection as a fundamental need. So first step would be to accept that feelings about social connection and lack thereof are real, and we do need friendships in life. We have a deeper need for that. The second action step and more practical things that we could do is consider and reconsider our environment. And in this action step guide, I'm going to go from more and more broad and things that may be less in our control to more specific things like what to say and things that are more directly in our control. And I'm going to narrow in like that. So on the broadest level, we have to consider the environment. I think the science is clear that the environment matters. It matters where you are, it matters who you're close with, not just emotionally, but physically, because that might dictate who you're going to be emotionally close with. So it does matter where you live. If you live in a place where there may not be as many social opportunities and you have a higher appetite for social connection, you may want to consider moving in the long run. You may want to make plans. I'm not suggesting what you do, but environment matters. It doesn't even have to be this big move, by the way. You can even consider, are you placing yourself in environments where social connection can flourish? So are you visiting social venues? Are you visiting social, perhaps, competitions and awards and fitness clubs and whatever your interests are, dance classes? Are you taking that effort so that social connection is possible? Or are you relying too much on just effort, like texting people and that kind of thing, in which the environment may not be as suitable? So think about your environment. Take an audit of the place you're in, perhaps starting right from the city you're in to the more local environments. What sort of places do you frequent? Is conversation possible in those sorts of places? And is connection promoted in those sorts of places? Or are you just pretending to be together, but it's not really a thriving place for forming new friendships? So environment. Speaking on the broader environment point, we also have to take care of things like perhaps our nutrition and gut health. Now, as I said earlier, this sort of research is extremely new, but just from my personal experience, I do find that when I do eat healthy, I do have much more of a healthy appetite for social connection, and I do make others feel good as well because I myself am feeling good. Now, I don't know if there's a direct relationship to social connection in this and friendships, or is just me feeling good and therefore making others feel good. But it is something to keep in mind when we speak about the environment. It's not just the external environment, but it's also the environment that we create internally by the food we ingest and so on. So yes, to recap, be in spaces where you can make friendships and do not discount the role of the environment because the science says that matters. Now let's tackle the problem of rejection. A lot of people will be like, okay, I will go to environments. I might even talk to people on the streets or something, or people who I've never spoken to, who I wanted to speak to. But rejection. What happens if they do not want to speak to me? What happens if they are busy? Or what happens if, even worse, they find me not compatible with them? And this tends to be especially a problem if the kind of relationships you're seeking are more on the dating side, where there's just one person that someone else can get with. For the most part, I understand there are different styles of relationships. And even if with different styles, there are just a limited number of slots where you can have these deeper, intimate connections with. So what do you do about rejection? And for me, the best advice I can give you, with having done so many conversations and having been rejected so many times, is you can build a tolerance for rejection. So rejection is something that you can train against, which means that the way their first rejection hurts doesn't have to be the way your 50th rejection hurts. And at some point, you will burn out that circuit enough to be able to talk to people confidently. Now, in my experience, it never goes away completely. I don't want you to believe that you're going to be this apathetic person. But at least for me, I think I have a bit more of a healthy relationship with rejection. I feel that when someone rejects me, it indeed does feel bad, but it does not feel that I'm crushed, or it does not feel that I cannot talk to anyone else after that. There might be a bit of an off period, sure, if that person really meant a lot to me, especially if it's a close friend already and then there's a rejection there. But fundamentally, there's that understanding that I'm not the only one here. And people, it's not about me personally. There's like lots of factors that go into friendships and compatibility and relationships and dates and so on. And I think I personally have developed that maturity and understanding just by brute doing this a lot of times and talking to more people and asking more people out and that kind of thing. But on a more practical level, what you can do is progressively desensitize yourself to rejection. What that means is you can do something that is, let's say, 2 out of 10 on a fear level of getting rejected, and then do something which is 3 out of 10, and then slowly and steadily move your way up to 10 out of 10. So an example of this might be, this is my fear ladder. This is something that I created when I was overcoming my feelings of shyness and social anxiety and that kind of thing. My fear ladder, 2 out of 10, was singing while alone. La la la. Just crushed my social fear there. Other one was recording myself while singing. This was 3 out of 10. Posting myself while singing was 8 out of 10. And I'm clearly doing that now, although I realize I've not sang per se there. And my highest 10 out of 10 for my fear scale was giving high fives to people as I walk down the street. And we're talking strangers here. So just when you walk down an alleyway, you're just being like, hey, hello, hi, high five. And in this case, most people reject you. I can confirm. Some people are fun, and then that is a beautiful moment as well. So I advise you and encourage you to create a fear ladder like this for yourself. If you need inspiration, you can check out the Leibowitz Social Anxiety Scale, LSAS. And this is the standard scale that is used in the assessment of social anxiety. And what you can do is take inspiration about different action that scale lists. You don't even have to do the whole questionnaire. You can just take inspiration from that and then rate your personal fear levels on those actions, like giving high fives to people or singing in public or asking someone out or asking your crush out and things like that. Write down all of these actions. I encourage them to be like 20, 30, 40, 50 of them. And then besides each one of them, write down the fear that you feel for each action. And then what you're going to do is order them in ascending level of fear. So it's nice if you do it digitally so that it's easier to compose this list. And then that's it. Just now start knocking off maybe 2 actions per week. So don't rush it. It took me years to be more and more socially confident. It's definitely a progressive thing. So you don't have to rush it at all. So I highly recommend doing this fear ladder exercise. It will serve you really well. So far, we have been talking about rejection coming from others. There's another source of rejection. That's right. That's yourself. And this is often called as embarrassment or awkward or shy and so on. You can use many words for this, but embarrassment is what I'm going to roll with. And just like you can train for rejection, the other one, you can train for self-rejection. And you can do embarrassing things intentionally. Now, of course, without harming others, goes without saying, and even without disturbing others. But one of my favorite exercises for embarrassment has been to dress in a peculiar way just for one day. So there was this one day that I just went out dressing not what I usually do. So I was like all pink and I wore a suit over that pink hoodie or something. Just something really absurd and something really eye-catchy. And indeed people notice and we laugh about it and that's it. Nothing happens. And so you will feel much more of a sense of freedom if you do something like that. Other exercises that I have done is laying down on a sidewalk. So I go out and I lay down and then people walk and some people notice you. Most people don't even notice you, by the way, when you do something like that. Of course, be safe. And again, don't do that in the middle of the street. Take safety precautions, of course. But other than that, the world is your oyster. And as long as, in this case, you're not even saying hi to anyone. So you're just doing your own thing. Of course, you can go out and sing, and those are more standard things that you can do. And the practice of friendly greetings is one of the best things I've ever done for my social confidence, which is, look, if you're going to work tomorrow or if you're going to school, all you have to do is say hi to most, if not everyone on your way. And when you're doing it as a practice, I would say hi to everyone on your way. And you're going to feel awesome about it. You're going to get over rejection immediately. You're going to see the whole process of how confidence works and how rejection works. And while you will not be immune to it, you'll feel awesome, I promise you. Especially if someone says hi back to you. Like rejections might feel bad, but if you find someone who says hi back to you, especially cheerfully, and that happens a lot, then you're going to feel great. So I recommend doing that. If these kinds of exercises are too hard and if you're struggling just putting yourself out there, then it might benefit if you hire someone to coach you or hire a therapist who might be able to walk you through this depending on your problem. So professional help might be a good idea. Even if it is not of the clinical kind, it will serve you well if you are struggling to get yourself out there. Now, while doing all of these exercises that I mentioned, you may notice that these changes that these exercises create may or may not be lasting. So you may get over your fear of rejection when you do friendly greetings and you go and say hi to people. And by the 3rd, 4th, 5th, certainly by the 10th hello, you will be pretty much immune to rejection. You'll feel like a god, especially if you have never experienced this before. But what you'll notice is that when you come home and when you go out again 2-3 days later, you would have lost that momentum. And that is when I started looking deep and deep into inner game, looking deep into what I call self-esteem and inner love, you might call it, or inner satisfaction. So I'm tuning inward as opposed to going outward. And the self-esteem puzzle is that oftentimes when we feel rejection, we are putting our esteem lower than the person's esteem who we are getting rejected from. So you might think that you're here, but the other person might think that they are there. And as a result, there is that esteem gap, and therefore the rejection that you feel from this person hurts. You may notice that a rejection from someone who you feel is lower in the social hierarchy than you doesn't hurt as much. So for example, if you go out and some irrelevant person who's looking distressed and distraught rather, and that person says, you look awful, it might not matter to you as much as when someone who you really care about, let's say your childhood crush, comes and says that. And so that's where there's a game of self-esteem that's happening. And a lot of relief from that is recognizing that all humans have equal worth. Like these social hierarchies are competences. They are not necessarily human worths. So they might be better at something, let's say looks, for example, which may or may not be true, but you may have other qualities. And on a more fundamental human level, I believe worth comes from both. And if you're interested in going deep into this, I've made a whole podcast episode on this, on shame, which I highly recommend that you watch, and self-esteem indeed. The other thing to bear in mind in this area is something called as the halo effect. Now, the halo effect is when you take someone and let's say they are good at something, let's say they are good looking, and now our brains have this psychological mechanism where we assume that they must be good at others as well. So this is the classic way in which we tend to idolize celebrities, because they might be good at acting, they might be great on screen, but we just somehow assume that they must now be great people. And they must be they must be intelligent, right? Of course, right? And that's not true. That's a cognitive fallacy. Sure, they're great at acting. Sure, this person might be great at maths. Sure, this person might be great at dancing. But they may not be good at each other's things. And just realizing that, for me, helps me put everyone on a level field and not put anyone on a pedestal just because they're good looking or just because they belong to a socioeconomic group and so on and so forth. So self-esteem and halo effect are quite linked and go quite hand in hand. And in fact, there is a whole video I made on self-esteem on this episode, on this channel and this podcast. So do check them out. I'll put some notes so that you can go deeper into other areas and more specific topics. Speaking on the relationship between inner well-being and outer well-being, which is social well-being, I think this theory and this model summarizes the whole interaction very well and consolidates it very well. Now, this comes from IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy, which suggests that your internal social environment, first of all, now this comes from Internal Family Systems Therapy, which says that we are not one individuals, but we are a collection of parts. So even within me, there is a social environment going on. And my relationship within my own parts is representative of my relationship with others outside of me. So my internal social environment and the quality of that can determine the quality of my external social environment. My mind is simply a microcosm of the larger social environment. And what this does is basically says that if you have good inner harmony, then that basically is job done. And you will have good outer harmony when you are interacting with friends and making new friends and making new relationships. And this is where shame and vulnerability comes in. When you are afraid of going out and talking to people, there's a part of you that is ashamed or afraid, and it doesn't want to show that side of you. But also you have that desire to go and talk to people, which is another part of you. And IFS model helps explain this very well, where it says that, look, you have to talk to this part who is feeling ashamed and afraid. And when you expose this part to yourself and consequently later to the world, you're going to experience therapeutic relief. You're going to experience lightness. And this is why authenticity feels so good. This is when someone is sharing a secret or someone is sharing something deeper to them. We all zone in, we all lock in, and we want to listen to them. And that is because shame is something that we all feel. And when someone is doing that and sharing themselves despite the shame, then we feel really good. A good So authenticity leads to connection. And if you're looking to deepening connections with your friends, and this whole podcast has been more on the starting friendships rather than deepening friendships side of things. So I'm not going to go deep into it, but one tip I could give is with shame and vulnerability, there's this one game you could play, which is called One Thing I Do Not Want to Know About Me Is. And again, I took this from Aziz Gazipura. And so what you do is you sit with your partner or friend or close friend or someone, and then you both go saying, hey, look, one thing I don't want you to know about me today is blah, blah, blah. So one thing that I don't want you to know about me today is that I was actually a bit scared to do this long form thing. Like, I'm not particularly anxious in front of the camera, but doing something this long, so tiring. I don't know how it'll go. And so here I am. And hopefully this is valuable to you. And you can't reply back to me, but I encourage you to play this game with anyone who would to play it with you. And just notice how you feel after I shared that. Like, I feel a bit better just by saying that. And there's no one there either. So I highly recommend you try out this game. A good resource on the shame, vulnerability side of things is this psychologist called Brené Brown. She has fantastic books and TED Talks on shame and vulnerability and what the effects of sharing are. And she says that shame cannot survive sharing. So if you're in the spiral of, look, I'm not good enough, shame, by the way, is a sense of I'm not good enough, then if you're in the spiral of, look, who will want to talk to me, I'm not good enough, I'm a bad person, then just share this with someone who would hear that. And you'll feel good. And you'll feel good, my friend. You'll feel good. And which brings me to this larger point of conversations and social connection is simply an exchange of feelings. That's right. All you're doing when you're having a conversation is exchanging each other's feelings. A conversation is an exchange of emotions, and therefore social skills are largely emotional skills. We talk to people because we feel better. We want to feel better. We want to feel healthier. We want to feel mentally engaged. And therefore conversations are therefore just exchanges of energy. And social skills therefore boil down to largely emotional skills. So any of the emotional intelligence content I've talked about in this podcast or on the YouTube channel or anywhere else you might read about emotional intelligence, you are indeed developing social skills. Now, this is not to say that there is no such thing as going out and talking to people and working on your communication and speaking and all of that, but largely you're working on emotions. So a conversation is simply an exchange of emotions. And therefore, it follows that if you want to make friends with someone, then you have to focus on making them feel good. You don't have to focus on what the next thing to say is. This is quite common, especially in the dating world, where there's like lines that you want to memorize, and going to talking to people may not be the best approach, because when your brain is focused on memorizing lines and regurgitating those lines, then you may lose touch with the feelings. And your primary intention should be to make others feel good. And so one thing I like to do is before, let's say, going out and going in a social environment, I sometimes like to reflect on what are the things that I want others to feel. What are the things that I want this person to feel when I talk to them? Like this person who I find extremely attractive, and I hope and I wish that I would go out with this person, and I'm going to meet them today. How do I want them to feel? And how can I make their day? That would be something that I would focus much more than focusing on the lines and stuff like that. And therefore, it also follows that I think the exact lines don't matter. So even if you want to memorize a line or two, if you're really anxious, that's fine. But it really doesn't matter as long as the feelings are in check. No one is going to say that, hey, look, when we became close friends, if you hadn't said that first line you said, we would have actually not talked. No one says that. Very unlikely. Do not worry too much about particular lines that you say. What matters more are the emotions, and the way to convey emotions therefore can be different. So that in this place, we could go back to the whole looks debate. It could be healthier to dress up well, to style well, to use a good fragrance. All of these work on emotions directly. One thing that I absolutely love is vocal warm-ups. Every time I record this video and every time before recording these videos, I do vocal warm-ups, and I learned a lot from this man called Roger Love. And if you're interested in tuning your voice so that it sounds better in people, then there's more range in your voice and there's just more enthusiasm and excitement, then I recommend checking out Roger Love's stuff. Or you could just do some vocal singing coaching and then automatically your voice will have some range in it. And then use that range, flex that range when you're talking to people. Do not speak like this in a monotonous voice. That is not fun. That is boring. And if I did the whole conversation in a low volume and in a monotonous voice, then soon you will tune out. That was boring, wasn't it? And in fact, I've myself feel that loss of energy just by doing this demo for you. Having said that, emotions are the most important thing. There are some techniques and some toolkits that you can use to improve your conversational skills. One of them is what's called yes-anding. Now, this is a concept from improv comedy, improv acting, where you just take something someone has said and you just say yes and you complete that sentence. So if I say, hello, nice to meet you today. Look, the weather is so wonderful today. And I would be like, yes, and the blue sky looks fantastic. Now, I don't particularly recommend talking about the weather, but this is an example of yes-anding. So if someone says, such a funny day, I saw this person who was hilarious, and I'm like, haha, yes, and I saw a magician who showed me some fantastic magic tricks. Isn't that engaging already? Something like that. There is such a thing as a hook point, which means if you're meeting someone new, and it doesn't have to be in person either, even on YouTube, the first 1 minute or 2 minutes or so tends to matter a lot. And that is the time where people make that decision whether they want to engage further with you or not. So if you are in a party and if you want to meet someone, it might be useful to have some emotional spikes stacked at the front. So this could be like a common question that you're going to get asked is, what do you do for work? Or what do you do for a living? Or what do you study? And instead of just saying that, hey, look, I study psychology, I like to say that, hey, I study happiness, or I study friendships, and I study how friendships start. And that is much more of a hook than, hey, I study psychology. And in fact, I sometimes say that, hey, look, I study friendships and I also have a podcast. And now it's even better hook. So speaking of creative, just have some creative ways in which you answer some common questions, and that guarantees a hook so that you then get the time to talk to someone and make a more deeper connection. Now, again, I don't particularly strategize to this level of depth, but in case you're struggling and if you need more toolkits, then this is another sort of arrow in your arsenal that you can use whenever you please. Things like teasing, banter, humor, all of these things are wonderful. So do use them. Of course, playfully. I don't mean teasing in terms of insulting someone. Never, ever do that. I don't see any reason why one should do that, and always promote healthy and wonderful social interactions. But playful teasing is wonderful. Banter is wonderful and especially works well with romantic and those sorts of situations. Although I like to have a laugh with every friend and every connection I have. So there's a close friend I have who I always greet by genius. Hello, Mr. Genius, that kind of thing. It works wonderfully well, brings a smile on everyone's face. Yeah, remember, it's all about feelings. Do it. And you can learn all of these things, by the way, teasing, banter, humor, flirting, if you want to go in the romantic route. All of these are learnable and you can look up things online. I don't have a lot on teasing or banter, but I do have other things on conversation skills that you can check out. And as I said, have a sort of story or things like that in your pocket that you can use to describe yourself, for common questions and things like that. So that will ensure that you can keep people engaged, and there's nothing wrong in having some things pre-prepared, so to speak, because you're going to be asked that a lot. And instead of riffing about the weather that no one really cares about, you might riff about something that you are truly passionate about and you truly like, and shows more of you. And this will bring more friends to your life, hopefully. All right, so I think this is a good place to wrap. And this concludes the tips and the science. We talked about the science in terms of brain, neuroscience, in terms of social psychology like proximity and similarity and how that leads to friendships. And we talked about Dunbar's number and the amount of friendships you can and cannot maintain. I just want to wrap by sharing a personal experience. Like if you think of me as socially confident, that is true. I am pretty socially confident now. But I was not like that. If you look at my past, I was relatively shy. I had enough confidence to go on the stage and things like that. I was a good performer. I did a lot of like solo acting and dancing when I grew up. But also I prefer to be shy. And even now, I'm more of an introvert, so I don't always want to be out with people. But I realized that the introvert stuff is fine because I like to be alone and I like to read and meditate and record videos like this and so on. But I did realize there is a component of my shyness which is not particularly healthy. This is like when I'm putting others on a pedestal just because someone is more attractive than I am, or just because someone is comes from a certain background that I don't come from, and all of that. Let's say I come from India and I stay here and in the UK, and then someone in the UK, somehow I look at them on a higher light. And a lot of people who immigrate have this sense of inferiority. And that part I believe is unhealthy, because I believe everyone is equally human, has equal human worth. So I have made it for the last few years an explicit part of my life to make social fitness a priority. So I've hired coaches. I worked with Dr. Aziz. I've spoken about that in multiple points in this episode. I have a whole interview with him if you want to listen to that. And someone who's an expert in social confidence, speak with them. It doesn't have to be a coach that you pay. It could be someone who's an extrovert in your circle, and you may be like, hey, I really love how you talk to people. Can you just take me out whenever you go out and I'll just be there? That kind of thing. And I'll talk to some of your friends and that kind of thing. And people be like, yeah, let's do this, because why not? And right now, I don't even personally consider myself an extrovert. I would say I'm more of an ambivert. I can be introverted or I can be extroverted. But that's the thing I want to leave you with, is make it an explicit part of your life. I did so, and I had extremely great results. There was this one particular thing I did was, I called this the marathon of social freedom. I went to the streets of London with a good friend of mine, and this is another tip. Get a friend who was willing to do these things with you, who's willing to flex and exercise those social muscles as much as we are willing to exercise the health muscles, like the actual muscles. So I went out with a friend and I did social freedom practices, which is talking to strangers, making new friends, making connections, lighting people's day for hours. And I called it the half marathon because at the end of the day, when I checked my Apple Watch status, I realized I've walked half marathon distances just talking to strangers. And that is one of the most beautiful days of my life. I have never felt as good in my life as I have felt on that day. And I can only recommend that you do at least a little bit of that, if not all of it. And the final message I want to leave you with is, if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling that you do not have social confidence, then that is not set in stone at all. There are things you can do. I know for myself, and I know beyond doubt, that this is changeable. And social confidence can be developed. Now, of course, there might be complications. You might have to get help and so on and so forth. But I believe, especially in the non-clinical side of things, that social confidence anyone can have, given the right amount of practice. And just a few rejection exercises, and if you just keep going on despite a few rejections, you'll see that. You'll feel it for yourself. And then that will be addictive. Just like exercises, when you see your muscles grow, it is addictive. Social freedom works in a similar way. And then sooner or later, you will be giving public speaking communication talks. You would be thriving on the stage. You would be speaking in front of cameras. You'll be making new friends. And you will feel socially connected. And you'll feel belonged. And you'll feel part of a group. It's a work in progress. I'm not completely there yet, but I've made massive progress. And I hope you do that as well. This has been a long conversation, and it's been a pleasure of my life to introduce you to the science of social connection and also some practical tips on how to make new friends. May you be happy. May you have a lot of friends in your life, and may you live with ease. Thank you for listening so far.